The universe, by all rights of logic and mathematics, should be empty. This is the silent crisis at the heart of modern physics, a structural flaw in the foundation of reality that scientists have spent a century trying to ignore, or at least politely explain away. According to the Standard Model, the moment the Big Bang ignited, energy condensed into matter. But physics is a mirror game. For every electron of matter, an anti-electron, positron, must have been born. For every proton and antiproton, they were cosmic twins, identical in mass but opposite in charge. The laws are clear. When matter and antimatter meet, they annihilate in a flash of pure energy. If the scales had been balanced, the infant universe would have been a chaotic soup of light and heat that quickly fizzled into a cold, dark void. No stars, no planets, no one to ask why. Yet, here we are. The asymmetry problem is the realization that a slight cheat occurred in the first billionth of a second of existence. For every billion particles of antimatter created, there was 1,000,000,001 particles of matter. That tiny 1 in a billion surplus, the leftover dust from a cosmic war of attrition, is what formed every galaxy, every sun, and every human cell. For decades, we called this CP violation and assumed it was just a quirk of our local laws. But inside the subterranean tunnels of the CERN facility in 2026, a routine experiment on antiproton deceleration was about to prove that the cheat wasn't a mistake. It was a puncture wound from somewhere else. The antiproton decelerator, cold light in the dark doctor. Elena Vance stared at the monitors of the Elena extra-low-energy antiproton ring, her eyes burning from 18 hours of back-to-back shifts. The facility, buried deep beneath the Swiss-French border, felt like a cathedral of cold steel and superconducting magnets. Antimatter is the most expensive and volatile substance in existence. It must be kept in a vacuum, more perfect than deep space, suspended by magnetic fields, because the moment it touches the walls of its container, it ceases to exist. Elena's team was working on trapping antiprotons, slowing them down to a crawl so their properties could be measured with unprecedented precision. Current at stable, her lead technician Eris murmured. Magnetic trap at 0.5 Kelvin. We're ready for the injection. The goal was simple. Measure the magnetic moment of the antiproton to 10 decimal places. If it differed from the proton by even a fraction, they would have found the source of the asymmetry. They expected a tiny discrepancy. They did not expect a stowaway, the Lazarus Anomaly. As the antiprotons were funneled into the penning trap, the sensors spiked. This wasn't the jagged noise of a vacuum leak or a power surge. It was a rhythmic, oscillating pulse. Elena, look at the mass-to-charge ratio, Eris said, his voice dropping an octave. The antiproton is heavier. That's impossible, Elena snapped, leaning in. If the mass changes, it's not an antiproton. It's a different species of matter. It's not just heavier, Eris countered, his fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the data. The extra mass isn't distributed. It's localized. There is something inside the antiproton. The room went silent. In the world of subatomic physics, an antiproton is a fundamental composite of 3 antiquarks. There is no room for something else. It would be like finding a gold watch inside a marble. They ran the scan again and again. Each time, the results were more haunting. Nested within the shell of the antiproton was a subparticle that shouldn't exist. It didn't react to the strong nuclear force. It didn't seem to care about the electromagnetic field holding the antiproton in place. It was a ghost, a tiny, shivering point of energy that sat within the antimatter, like a passenger. Elena nicknamed it the Lazarus Particle. It had been born from the death of the vacuum, but it didn't belong to the funeral. The impossible geometry. As the night bled into morning, the team began to map the Lazarus Particle's coordinates. This is where the asymmetry problem shifted from a mystery of physics to a crisis of reality. In standard physics, a particle's position is defined by 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. But the Lazarus Particle didn't stay fixed. Its coordinates drifted in a way that defied Euclidean geometry. It seemed to be rotating into a direction that Elena's eyes couldn't follow. S equals integral LD to the 4th x, the standard Lagrangian density equation, L, which describes how particles should behave in 4-dimensional space-time, failed to account for the particle's energy signature. To make the math work, Elena had to add variables, not 1, not 2, but 6 extra spatial dimensions. "It's not just a particle," Elena whispered, the glow of the screen reflecting in her pupils. "It's a tether." She realized that the reason we had an asymmetry problem, the reason matter won the war at the beginning of time, wasn't because of a random fluke. It was because our universe is not a closed system. The Lazarus Particle was a physical link to a sister universe, a parallel sheet of reality where the balance was reversed. In our world, matter is the king and antimatter is the rare, unstable exception. In the world the Lazarus Particle hailed from, antimatter was the foundation, and we were the ghosts. The void calls back. The philosophical implications began to crash over the team. If the Lazarus Particle was a bridge, it implied that the Big Bang hadn't been an explosion into nothingness. Instead, it was more like the splitting of a cell. Imagine 2 sheets of paper pressed together. On one sheet, a drop of blue ink, matter, is spilled. On the other, a drop of red ink, antimatter. Usually they stay separate, but if the sheets are pressed hard enough, a tiny bit of red ink might soak through the fibers into the blue side. The Lazarus Particle was that drop of red ink. It was proof that the other was real, and it was close. "If this particle is here," Eris asked, "does that mean there's a version of this lab on the other side? A version of us?" Elena didn't answer. She was looking at the last line of data. The Lazarus Particle was vibrating. It wasn't the random jitter of heat. It was a sequence. It was a prime number oscillation. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. The asymmetry problem was no longer about why we exist. It was about who was watching us from the other side of the mirror. The cheat in our physics wasn't a flaw. It was an invitation. The weight of existence. By the time the sun rose over the Jura Mountains, the world was exactly the same as it had been the day before. But for the 4 people in that control room, the sky looked different. They had spent their lives believing they were the accidental survivors of a cosmic coin toss. They thought they were alone in an infinite, indifferent vacuum. But the Lazarus Particle changed the narrative. We were part of a pair, a binary system of universes locked in a gravitational and quantum embrace. The asymmetry problem was solved, but the solution was more terrifying than the mystery. We were not the sole masters of reality. We were merely half of a conversation that had been going on since the dawn of time. Elena reached out and touched the screen, where the tiny dot of the Lazarus Particle pulsed with a pale, defiant light. "We're not alone," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the weight of 1 billion light years of sudden company. "We've never been alone." The atmosphere in the Elena control room had shifted from the frantic energy of discovery to the heavy, suffocating tension of a stakeout. The Lazarus Particle was no longer just a data point. It had become an inhabitant. It sat nestled within its magnetic cradle, a subatomic squatter that defied every effort of the team to categorize it using the standard nomenclature of the universe. Dr. Elena Vance hadn't slept in 36 hours. Her reflection in the darkened glass of the observation chamber was a ghost in its own right, pale, hollow-eyed, and barely anchored to the room. She was obsessed with the harmonic. If the particle was a tether, as the math suggested, then the rhythmic pulsing they were witnessing wasn't just physics. It was biology. Or perhaps, more accurately, it was intelligence. "The signal is deepening," Aris said, his voice cracking. He hadn't left his terminal either. "The oscillations are no longer confined to prime numbers. We're seeing clusters now, geometric patterns in the spin state. Elena, it's building a shape." The detection array, peering into the bulk. To understand what the Lazarus Particle was doing, the team had to look beyond the 3 dimensions of the laboratory. They began constructing what Eris called the detection array, a software layer designed to interpret the particle's behavior not as a single point in space, but as a cross-section of a higher dimensional object passing through our reality. In physics, the bulk refers to the higher dimensional hyperspace in which our 4-dimensional universe is embedded. If our universe is a sheet of paper, the bulk is the room the paper sits in. The Lazarus Particle was like the tip of a needle poking through that paper. From our perspective, we only saw a tiny circular hole. But by measuring how the hole vibrated and moved, Elena's team could begin to infer the shape and intent of the needle itself. "The array is picking up leaking gravity," Elena noted, her pen scratching furiously against a legal pad. "The particle's mass is fluctuating because it's not entirely here. It's shedding energy into the bulk and then pulling it back. It's breathing." The mechanical ghost, the machine in this scenario, was the CERN complex itself. Miles of superconducting magnets, liquid helium cooling systems, and sensors sensitive enough to detect the footfall of a sparrow a kilometer away. But as the Lazarus Particle stabilized, the machine began to behave strangely. Secondary sensors in the Large Hadron Collider, LHC, kilometers away from the Elena ring, began to report phantom collisions. The power grid flickered with a frequency that matched the particle's spin. It was as if the presence of the Lazarus Particle was infecting the hardware of the facility, turning the most complex machine on Earth into a giant resonator for a signal from another world. "It's using the magnets," Eris realized, his eyes wide. "The particle isn't just sitting in the trap. It's using the penning trap's magnetic field as an antenna. It's trying to amplify itself." "Amplify what?" Elena asked. "The bridge. It's trying to widen the puncture." The realization sent a chill through the room. If the particle was a bridge, and it was being manually widened, then they weren't just observing a natural phenomenon. They were witnessing a construction project. On the other side of the antimatter veil, someone, or something, was pushing back. The parity paradox. Elena pulled up the live feed of the particle's parity. In our universe, most things follow the law of symmetry. If you flip a particle's charge and mirror its position, the laws of physics should remain the same. This is known as CP symmetry, but the Lazarus particle was a walking violation of this law. Its parity was bleeding. When they looked at it through the detection array, it appeared to be rotating in a way that was mathematically impossible in a three-dimensional world. P/psi of r equals psi of minus r. In standard quantum mechanics, the parity operator, P, acts on a wave function, psi. For the Lazarus particle, the operator returned a value that was imaginary, a complex number that suggested the particle was partially rotated into a fifth dimension. "It's a ghost in the machine," Elena whispered. "It's a piece of software from a parallel OS trying to run on our hardware. No wonder the system is crashing." The first ping. "We have to talk to it," Eris said. The suggestion felt like heresy. You don't talk to subatomic particles. You measure them. You collide them. You record their decay. But the Lazarus particle wasn't decaying. It was persistent. It was waiting. "If it's using the magnets as an antenna," Elena mused, "we can modulate the field. We can send a pulse back through the trap, a reflection of its own frequency." They spent hours calibrating the feedback loop. The idea was simple. They would mirror the particle's own oscillations and beam them back into the heart of the antimatter. If the particle was a natural fluke, the interference would likely destabilize it, causing it to annihilate or vanish back into the bulk. But if it was a signal— "Modulation set," Eris announced, initiating the ping in 3, 2, 1. The facility groaned. The massive magnets hummed with a low, bone-shaking frequency. For a split second, the lights in the control room didn't just flicker. They turned a deep, bruised violet, a color that shouldn't have been possible given the LED bulbs in the ceiling. Then, silence. The monitors went flat. The rhythmic pulsing of the Lazarus particle stopped. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Had they killed it? Had they broken the only link to the multiverse? "Wait," Eris said, leaning so close to the screen his breath fogged the glass. "Look at the entropy readings." The entropy inside the trap, the measure of disorder, was dropping. It was becoming perfectly ordered. The particle wasn't gone. It had flattened itself, becoming a mirror. Then the screen erupted. A new signal appeared on the monitor. It wasn't the prime number sequence from before. It was something new, something recognizable. It was a map, the architect's shadow. The data flowing into the detection array began to render a three-dimensional projection in the center of the room. It wasn't a map of Earth, or even of our galaxy. It was a map of a cluster of universes, huge, glowing bubbles of reality, drifting in an endless, dark sea. The Lazarus particle was a beacon, marking our specific bubble. And as they watched, they saw other beacons lighting up in the neighboring bubbles, hundreds of them, thousands. "It's not just one other universe," Elena realized, her voice trembling. "It's an ecosystem. The multiverse isn't a theory anymore, it's a neighborhood." And in the center of the map, where the bubbles were closest together, there was a void, a gap that was being filled by a shadow. The ghost wasn't just a particle. It was a scout. The machine began to scream, a high-pitched electronic whine that tore through the room. The magnetic trap was reaching its breaking point. The Lazarus particle was pulling more and more energy from the CERN grid, drawing it into the bulk to fuel the map's projection. "Shut it down," Elena yelled. "Eris, kill the magnets before the whole ring blows." "I can't," Eris shouted back over the noise. "The particle is overriding the lockout. It's taking the power directly from the superconductors." Just as the temperature in the trap began to climb toward the critical point of a quench, a catastrophic failure of the magnets, the map vanished. The room went black. In the sudden, ringing silence, only one thing remained. On the main monitor, in clear, sharp, high-definition text, a script that used the facility's own character set, was a single word: received. The ghost in the machine had spoken, and it knew exactly where we were. The word received stayed burned into the retina of the CERN control room long after the monitors were manually killed. It wasn't just a message. It was a confirmation of a breach. For 80 years, humanity had peered through the telescope at the stars, wondering if anyone was out there. We had been looking in the wrong direction. We were looking out when we should have been looking through. By the second week of the Lazarus event, the Asymmetry Problem had evolved into a parity crisis. The particle, now colloquially known as the guest, was no longer a passive resident of the penning trap. It had become a structural anchor. It was the first stone in what Dr. Elena Vance began to call the Parity Bridge, the mirror that doesn't reflect in the clean room of the Elena facility. The laws of physics were beginning to fray at the edges. Parity, or p-symmetry, is the idea that the universe should not have a preference between left and right. If you watch a physical process in a mirror, the reflected version should be just as physically possible as the real one. But the Lazarus particle was chiral. It had a handedness that didn't exist in our world. As the particle drew more power from the CERN grid, it began to exert a parity field around the vacuum chamber. "Elena, look at the calibration weights," Eris whispered, pointing to a set of high-precision brass cylinders on a workbench 10 feet from the containment unit. Elena looked. Then she blinked, rubbing her eyes. The cylinders were there, but their shadows were wrong. The shadows weren't falling away from the overhead LED lights. They were leaning toward the containment unit, twisting at an angle that defied the geometry of the room. When she reached out to touch a wrench on the table, her hand felt a strange, magnetic resistance, not against her skin, but against her very sense of direction. When she tried to move her hand left, it drifted right. "The bridge is under construction," Elena said, her voice hollow. "It's not just sending data anymore. It's dragging our local space-time into alignment with its home universe. It's enforcing its own parity on us. The mathematics of the crossing. To understand the bridge, Elena had to return to the chalkboard. The standard model was no longer enough. She began to work with the Dirac equation, the mathematical bridge between quantum mechanics and special relativity. In its standard form, the equation describes how fermions, like electrons, behave. I gamma mu partial mu minus m, psi equals 0. But the Lazarus particle required a modification. Elena had to introduce a source term from a parallel Hilbert space. The particle wasn't just a wave function, psi. It was a composite of two wave functions from two different universes, coupled by a constant she dubbed the multiversal tension, T. As T increased, the bridge became more solid. The two universes were like two soap bubbles beginning to merge. At the point of contact, the Elena trap, the surface tension was breaking down. "We aren't just looking at another world," Elena explained to the frantic UN Oversight Committee via video link. "We are being grafted onto it. Imagine a skin graft, but for the fabric of reality. The bridge is the scar tissue, the shadow lab. On the 19th day, the visual anomalies moved from shadows to ghosts. It started with a shimmering in the air near the liquid helium lines. At first, the team thought it was a gas leak, a distortion caused by temperature gradients. But the shimmer had a shape. It was a console, a desk, a figure. "Eris!" Elena called out, her heart hammering. "Don't move!" In the center of the lab, a translucent, violet-hued version of their own workspace was manifesting. It was a parity mirror. In this version of the lab, the layout was reversed. The exit door was on the left instead of the right. The monitors displayed a script that looked like Cyrillic merged with equations, and there was a person. The figure was blurred, vibrating with the same high-frequency harmonic as the Lazarus Particle. It was a woman. She was wearing a lab coat, standing exactly where Elena was standing, staring at a monitor that occupied the same space as Elena's. They were looking at their counterparts. In the Antimatter universe, another team had found a Lazarus Particle made of matter. They had built their own detection array. They had sent their own ping. The Parity Bridge was being built from both sides simultaneously, two drowning civilizations reaching for each other through the dark. The collapse of the veil. The danger became apparent when Eris tried to pass a physical object through the shimmering interface. He took a simple graphite pencil and moved it toward the mirror lab. As the pencil's tip entered the parity field, it didn't just disappear, it inverted. The wood turned into a substance that looked like polished obsidian. The graphite began to glow with a faint Cherenkov blue. But more terrifyingly, the pencil began to pull Oris's arm with a force that threatened to snap his radius. "Pull back," Elena screamed, grabbing Oris by the waist and yanking him away. The pencil snapped. The half that had entered the field vanished with a crack like a gunshot, followed by a localized burst of gamma radiation that set off every alarm in the sector. "Matter and antimatter," Eris gasped, clutching his arm. "The bridge isn't stable. The laws are fighting. If we touch that other side, we don't just meet them. We annihilate them." This was the terrifying reality of the Parity Bridge. It was a bridge made of high-voltage wire. The two universes were fundamentally incompatible at a molecular level. Our atoms were right-handed. Theirs were left-handed. To cross the bridge was to invite a total conversion of mass into energy. The architect's message. Despite the danger, the figure in the mirror, Elena's counterpart, seemed desperate. She began to write on her version of the glass. Because of the parity reversal, the writing appeared perfectly legible to Elena. "Stop the quench," the mirror Elena wrote. Elena froze. How does she know about the quench? The CERN engineers were planning to quench the magnets, to shut down the superconducting fields by venting the liquid helium. It was the only way to kill the power to the Lazarus Particle and break the connection. It was scheduled for 2 hours from now. The mirror Elena wrote again, her movements frantic. "The void is not empty. If you break the bridge, the breach stays open. Something else is coming through." The team looked at the map they had generated in Chapter 2. They remembered the shadow in the center of the multiverse, the void between the bubbles. The Parity Bridge wasn't just a way for two universes to talk. It was a dam. It was holding back the pressure of the bulk, a region of non-existence that was hungry for the energy of a structured universe. The Lazarus Particle hadn't been a scout. It was a plug, the final warning. As the 2 hours ticked down, the lab began to groan. The Parity Bridge was widening. The floor beneath Elena's feet began to turn translucent, revealing not the concrete foundations of the building, but an endless, swirling vortex of violet clouds and starfire. The mirror lab was becoming more solid by the minute. Elena could now hear the muffled sounds from the other side, a low, rhythmic thrumming, like a giant heart beating in a cathedral. The mirror Elena held up a device, a small, glowing sphere. It was a stabilizer. "We must lock the phases," the message appeared on the glass. "Don't shut down. Give us more power. We have to seal the perimeter." Elena looked at the emergency shutdown switch. If she flipped it, the bridge would collapse, likely killing the others and ending the threat of annihilation. But if the mirror Elena was right, breaking the bridge would leave a permanent hole in the fabric of their universe, a wound that the shadow would crawl through. "Eris," Elena said, her hand hovering over the power override. "We're not shutting down. We're going to redline the magnets." "Elena, that'll blow the whole sector." "If we don't," she said, looking her mirror self in the eye, "there won't be a sector left to blow in any universe." She reached for the dial. The Parity Bridge screamed. The two worlds began to bleed into one, and for the first time, Elena Vance felt the cold, crushing weight of the multiverse looking back at her. The decision to redline the magnets didn't just stabilize the Parity Bridge. It turned the CERN facility into a titanic musical instrument. As the power surged, the low-frequency thrumming that had characterized the Lazarus Particle's arrival shifted. It climbed through the octaves, bypassing the limits of human hearing and vibrating instead in the very marrow of the team's bones. This was the harmonic, a complex, multi-layered frequency that seemed to carry the weight of entire histories within its oscillations. "It's not noise," Elena whispered, her hands trembling as she adjusted the gain on the acoustic quantum transducers. "It's a data stream. We've been trying to read the book by looking at the ink molecules. We need to start looking at the sentences. The quantum score. In physics, every particle is essentially a wave, a ripple in a field. But the Lazarus particle was a ripple in multiple fields simultaneously. To decode it, Eris had to develop a new type of Fourier analysis, one that could account for imaginary frequencies leaking from the five-dimensional bulk. They began to feed the signal into the facility's supercomputing cluster. What emerged on the screens wasn't a graph or a string of binary. It was a visual representation that looked like a 4D orchestral score. Lines of light, curved and intersected, representing the voices of different universes. The Lazarus particle was the conductor, maintaining the rhythm that kept our universe and the mirror universe in sync. Psi total equals the sum from n equals 1 to infinity of a n e to the power I k n x minus omega nt. In this expanded wave function, each $n represented a different parallel reality. The harmonic was the fundamental frequency, omega n, that all stable universes shared. "The math is showing a resonance," Eris explained, pointing to a spike in the data. "Our universe vibrates at a specific pitch. The mirror universe vibrates exactly 1/2 step higher. Together, they create a tritone, the devil's interval. It's inherently unstable, which is why the bridge is so dangerous. But there's a third voice in the recording, a bass note. The language of the architects. As the decoding deepened, the score began to resolve into something more recognizable. Syntax. The harmonic wasn't just a natural byproduct of two universes touching. It was a transmission. The team watched in awe as the supercomputer began to translate the oscillations into mathematical constants. It started with the basics, the value of pi, the fine structure constant, the Planck length. These were the universal greetings, the common ground of any intelligent civilization. But then the harmonic changed. It became prescriptive. It's a blueprint, Elena realized. It's not just saying hello. It's telling us how to tune our reality. The other Elena in the mirror lab was doing the same. On the translucent glass of the Parity Bridge, the two women began to collaborate. They weren't using words anymore. They were using the harmonic. By humming at specific frequencies or modulating the magnetic fields, they could edit the data stream. They were learning the language of the multiverse, a language where a change in frequency could literally alter the mass of an atom or the speed of light within a localized area. The great symphony. The more they decoded, the more they understood the true nature of the Asymmetry Problem. The reason our universe had more matter than antimatter wasn't a mistake of the Big Bang. It was a choice. The harmonic revealed that the multiverse is an intentional construct, a symphony of interconnected membranes designed to prevent the encroachment of the void. The shadow they had seen in the map was a region of absolute zero-point energy, a place where information goes to die. The universes are like resonance chambers, Elena mused. Each one is tuned to a different frequency to keep the void from collapsing the whole structure. Our matter dominance and their antimatter dominance are just two different notes in a chord. If we were identical, the chord would be a monotone and the structure would shatter. The ghostly choir. As the decoding reached its peak, the lab began to fill with echoes. The harmonic was so powerful now that it was pulling audio and visual data from other, more distant universes. For a few seconds, the CERN control room was replaced by a lush, purple forest under a triple sun system. Then, a glimpse of a city built of liquid glass. They heard voices, thousands of them, speaking in tongues that sounded like birdsong, like grinding tectonic plates, like the static between radio stations. "We're hearing the multiverse," Eris said, tears streaming down his face. "All of them. Every version of history that ever was or could be. They're all part of the harmonic." But beneath the beauty of the symphony, there was a discordant note, a scratch on the record. The discordance. The decoding software began to throw errors. Red boxes flashed across the screens. Phase shift detected. Non-harmonic interference. Something was trying to shout over the symphony. It wasn't a note. It was a scream of white noise. On the multiverse map, the shadow in the center began to vibrate in a way that mimicked the Lazarus Particle. "It's mimicking us," Elena shouted over the rising whine of the magnets. "The void. It's not just a place. It's a predator. It's learned the harmonic. It's trying to hijack the bridge." The other Elena in the mirror looked terrified. She was pointing at the bass note on her screen. The fundamental frequency of the multiverse was being eroded. The void was eating the notes, turning the complex symphony into a flat, dead silence. If the harmonic stops, Auris realized, the universes lose their tension. They'll collapse into each other. Total annihilation. The countersong Elena knew what she had to do. They couldn't just listen to the harmonic anymore. They had to play back. Auris, we need to inject a dissonance loop into the magnets, she commanded. We need to create a frequency that the void can't mimic, something purely chaotic, something uniquely human. How? Everything we do is governed by the same physics. Elena looked at the mirror Elena. The two women shared a moment of profound, cross-universal clarity. They were the same person, yet entirely different. One was made of the dust of a matter sun, the other the embers of an antimatter star. The dissonance is us, Elena said. The fact that we are standing here, touching across a bridge that shouldn't exist. That's the anomaly. She grabbed the manual override for the magnetic modulation. She began to pulse the field, not in a mathematical sequence, but in the rhythm of her own heartbeat. On the other side, the mirror Elena did the same. Two hearts beating in two different universes, joined by a single particle of antimatter. The effect was instantaneous. The white noise of the void recoiled. The shadow on the map shivered and pulled back, unable to process the irregular biological rhythm of the two Elenas. The harmonic stabilized, but it was different now. It was no longer a recording of the past. It was a live performance. The final translation. As the energy settled, the supercomputer spat out a final translation of the most recent harmonic cluster. It wasn't a blueprint or a constant. It was a sentence delivered with the clarity of a bell. The symphony requires new voices. The Lazarus particle grew bright, then dimmed to a soft, pulsing violet. The bridge was no longer a wound or a dam. It was an open door. The asymmetry problem was solved. We weren't alone in the multiverse, and we weren't just observers. We were the performers, and the void was waiting for the next movement to begin. The received message had been a knock at the door. The harmonic had been the sound of voices through the wood. But with the stabilization of the Parity Bridge, the door didn't just open. The walls of the house simply ceased to exist. The CERN control room was no longer a room. It had become a cartographic hub for a reality that spanned beyond the edge of time. Using the decoded frequencies of the Lazarus Particle, Dr. Elena Vance and her team began the impossible task of charting the bulk. They were no longer just physicists. They were the first cartographers of the infinite, the geometry of the great beyond. To map the multiverse, one must first discard the concept of up and down, near and far. In the bulk, distance is not measured in kilometers or light years, but in phase shift. Think of it like a radio dial, Eris explained to the gathered world leaders via a secure holographic link. Our universe is 98.1 FM. The mirror universe is 98.2 FM. They are occupying the same physical space, but they don't hear each other because their frequencies don't overlap. The Lazarus particle is the needle that can bridge those stations. The map was rendered in the center of the lab as a shimmering, multi-dimensional lattice. It looked less like a map of stars and more like a neural network or a vast glowing coral reef. Each node in the reef was a brain, a self-contained universe with its own laws of physics, its own speed of light, and its own version of the Asymmetry Problem, the 5 families of reality. As Elena analyzed the data, she realized that the universes weren't scattered randomly. They were clustered into families based on their fundamental constants. The matter-dominant, the Goldilocks cluster, universes like ours, where the slight surplus of matter allowed for the creation of stars, planets, and carbon-based life. The antimatter mirrors, the left-handed realities. These were the most frequent neighbors to our own, locked in a delicate, gravitational dance across the dimensional divide. The high-entropy voids, realities where the cheat never happened. These were dark, cold, and dead, universes that had annihilated themselves instantly, leaving behind nothing but a thin fog of photons. The variable constant realms, the Wild West of the multiverse. In these nodes, the strong nuclear force was slightly stronger, or gravity was weaker. Here, stars were the size of houses, or galaxies were made of liquid light. The sentient brains, the most terrifying discovery on the map. These were universes where the very fabric of space-time was interconnected in a way that mimicked a biological brain. They weren't just places, they were beings, the great voids and the eaters. The map also revealed the empty spaces. Between the glowing clusters of universes lay vast, jagged territories of absolute blackness. These weren't just vacuum, they were non-space. The Lazarus data calls them the gaps, Elena noted, her laser pointer tracing a jagged hole in the lattice. They are regions where the harmonic has completely broken down, and they're growing. The map showed that the shadow they had encountered in Chapter 4 wasn't an isolated incident. The multiverse was being consumed. Like a blight on a leaf, the gaps were expanding, slowly erasing universes from the lattice. The Lazarus Particle hadn't just appeared by accident. It was part of a multiversal SOS. The neighbors were trying to tie their boats together before the tide pulled them into the dark. The U problem. The most existential part of the map was the identity flux. As the detection array refined its resolution, it began to pinpoint specific coordinates within the neighboring mirror universe. "We found the mirror CERN," Eris whispered. On the map, a tiny pulsing dot in the left-handed cluster corresponded exactly to their location in Geneva. But as they zoomed in, they saw something that broke their understanding of self. The map showed thousands of Elena Vances. In some universes, Elena had never become a physicist. She was a musician, a soldier, or had died in childhood. In others, she was the high architect of a global empire. The map wasn't just a layout of space. It was a catalog of every choice ever made. The map shows that we are not individuals, Elena realized, staring at the thousands of glowing threads that represented her own life path across the brains. We are a probability cloud. Every time we make a decision, the map grows a new branch. We are the architects of the reef. The Pathfinder Protocol. The UN committee demanded to know if the map could be used for travel. If we could see the other side, could we go there? The Parity Bridge is a walkway, not a highway, Elena warned. To move from a right-handed universe to a left-handed one requires a total molecular inversion. If we sent a human through now, they would explode with the force of 1,000 hydrogen bombs the moment they touched a single atom of the other side. But the map offered a loophole, the neutral zones. There were points on the map where the frequencies of two universes perfectly canceled each other out. areas of zero parity. In these zones, matter and antimatter could coexist in a state of quantum superposition. They were the DMZs of the multiverse. If we want to meet the others, Eris suggested, we don't go to their house, and they don't come to ours. We meet in the lobby. The first coordinate. The team selected a neutral zone located in the Lagrange point between our universe and the mirror universe. On the map, it looked like a calm pool of violet light in the middle of a raging storm. They began to feed the coordinates into the LHC's magnets. They weren't looking for a particle anymore. They were looking for a destination. The map is locked, Eris announced. The Lazarus Particle is acting as the GPS. We have a clear path to the neutral zone. But as they prepared to send a drone through, the map did something unexpected. It began to rewrite itself. A new set of nodes appeared, pulsing with a frantic red light. They were coming from the sentient brains. They're responding to the map, Elena said, her voice trembling. The moment we mapped them, they mapped us back. They know we're looking. The weight of the world. By the end of the day, the map had grown to include over 10,000 distinct universes. The Asymmetry Problem that had started this journey felt like a grain of sand on a beach. Elena sat alone in the control room, the glowing lattice of the multiverse casting long, intricate shadows against the walls. She felt small, smaller than she had ever felt in her life. But she also felt a strange, new sense of responsibility. The map showed that the universes that survived the gaps were the ones that stayed connected. Isolation was a death sentence. The multiverse wasn't a collection of separate bubbles. It was a web. If one strand snapped, the whole thing began to unravel. We have the map, she whispered to the empty room. Now we just need the courage to follow it. The chapter ends with the first drone, Pathfinder 1, hovering in the center of the magnetic trap. Its cameras were set to broadcast not just in the visible spectrum, but in the harmonic. Initiate transit, Elena commanded. The drone vanished, not into a flash of light, but into a fold in reality. On the monitor, the map flickered. A single blue dot, our dot, began to move toward the violet pool of the neutral zone. We were no longer just looking at the map. We were stepping off the edge of the world. The silence in the CERN control room was no longer the silence of a laboratory. It was the silence of a tomb or a temple. On the main view screen, the telemetry from Pathfinder 1 flickered with a ghostly, rhythmic pulse. The drone had crossed the threshold of the Parity Bridge and was now drifting through the neutral zone, the cosmic lobby where our laws of physics met theirs in a tenuous, shimmering truce. Dr. Elena Vance held her breath. Beside her, Oris was white-knuckled, his eyes fixed on the feed. They were no longer looking at their world. The neutral zone appeared on the monitors as a vast kaleidoscopic nebula of zero-parity matter. It was a place where light didn't travel in straight lines, but in gentle, looping curves, and where the colors shifted through frequencies that the human eye struggled to categorize. Visuals stabilizing, Eris whispered. The drone's hull integrity is holding. The harmonic is at peak resonance. The meeting place. As the drone's cameras panned across the violet haze, a structure began to emerge from the mist. It wasn't a ship, nor was it a station in any sense that a 21st century engineer would recognize. It was a geometric fractal, a sprawling city of crystalline light that seemed to exist in multiple states of matter simultaneously. "It's a cathedral of symmetry," Elena murmured. The structure was the lobby, a permanent anchor point built by the others within the neutral zone. It was designed to withstand the volatile interface between matter and antimatter. As Pathfinder 1 drifted closer, the harmonic signal surged. It wasn't a siren or a ping anymore. It was a greeting. Suddenly, the drone was no longer alone. On the edge of the sensor array, a second signature appeared. It was moving with a grace that mocked the clunky, thruster-driven physics of the human probe. It was a craft from the mirror universe, an antimatter vessel. To the drone's matter-based sensors, the ship appeared as a shimmering void, a hole in the fabric of the nebula that glowed with a fierce, inverted radiance. The face in the mirror, the two craft hovered mere meters apart in the zero-parity vacuum. The moment of first contact had arrived. "They're initiating a phase lock," Harris announced. "They're trying to create a localized atmosphere of shared reality." The monitors blurred, then snapped into a clarity that was almost painful. The others were projecting a holographic interface, and in the center of that interface, there was a figure. It was the mirror Elena. Up close, without the distortion of the Parity Bridge's glass, the resemblance was haunting. She looked exactly like Elena Vance, yet her eyes were a deep, luminescent violet, a byproduct of the different stellar radiation in her home universe. She wore a suit that seemed woven from liquid silver, and her movements had a slight, rhythmic lag, as if she were being rendered by a world that ran on a different clock. She didn't speak with a voice. Instead, the harmonic translated her thoughts directly into the CERN audio systems. "You have come to the edge," the voice resonated, sounding like a choir of 1,000 versions of Elena. "We have waited since the first asymmetry. We have watched your bubble drift." The truth of the great divergence. Through the harmonic, the other Elena, who identified herself as Ilara, began to transmit the true history of the multiverse. The Asymmetry Problem wasn't a fluke of nature, but a defensive maneuver. Eons ago, the multiverse had been a single, symmetrical entity, but a calamity, the encroaching void they had seen on the map, had begun to dissolve the structure. To survive, the great architects, a civilization that predated the current universes, had shattered reality into matter and antimatter sectors. By separating us, Elena realized, her mind racing to keep up with the data dump, they created a barrier the void can't easily cross between matter and antimatter, because the parity shift acts like a firewall. "Yes," Ilara confirmed, "but the firewall is failing. The gaps are widening. To survive, the fragments must rejoin, not into one, but into a web. We must become a resonance network." The gift of the multiverse. The first contact wasn't just a meeting of minds. It was an exchange of technology. Ilara didn't offer weapons or fuels. She offered coordinates. She transmitted a sequence of quantum keys, data that would allow humanity to stabilize the Lazarus particles across the entire globe. With these keys, the asymmetry problem would no longer be a mystery to be solved, but a resource to be harvested. We could draw clean, infinite energy directly from the tension between universes. We could communicate instantly across any distance. We could, for the first time, truly see the neighbors. "This is the first step of the great integration," Ilara projected. You are no longer a solitary island. You are a node in the symphony. But with this sight comes a burden. You can now see the shadows, and the shadows can see you. The price of sight. As the data transfer completed, the neutral zone began to shake. On the multiverse map back in the control room, the shadow in the center made a sudden aggressive lurch toward the coordinates of the meeting. The void had sensed the bridge. "The connection is too strong," Eris yelled. "We're drawing it right to us." "Go," Ilara commanded. "Close the bridge for now. You have the keys. Build your defenses. Tune your world to the new harmonic. We will meet again when the symphony is ready." Elena didn't want to leave. She wanted to reach out and touch the hand of her mirror self, to know if it felt like skin or like light. But the reality around the drone was beginning to tear. The zero parity zone was being invaded by the non-space of the void, a terrifying, static-filled darkness that consumed color and sound alike. "Abort!" Elena shouted. "Recall the Pathfinder. Sever the bridge." The new dawn, with a violent surge of magnetic energy, the CERN magnets were forced into a total quench. The Parity Bridge collapsed. The Lazarus Particle, now fully tuned and stable, settled into a soft, steady glow within its trap, a permanent, quiet beacon. The lab went dark. The monitors died. The harmonic faded into a gentle background hum that felt as natural as a heartbeat. Elena sat in the dark for a long time. The world outside the facility, the world of 2026, of politics, of borders, of small-scale human squabbles, felt like a dream she had woken up from. "Eris," she said quietly. "Yeah, we solved the Asymmetry Problem." "We did," he replied, his voice shaking with awe. "But I think we just started a much bigger one." Epilogue. The symphony begins. The discovery of the Lazarus Particle and the subsequent first contact changed everything. Within months, the Lazarus keys were being used to revolutionize every aspect of human life. Energy scarcity vanished overnight. The multiverse map became the new atlas for a generation of phase explorers. But the true change was internal. Humanity could no longer pretend it was the center of the story. We were a single note in a grand, complex, and currently threatened symphony. Elena Vance stood on the balcony of the CERN headquarters, looking up at the night sky. She knew now that for every star she saw, there was a mirror star she couldn't see. And somewhere out there, in a left-handed version of Geneva, another Elena was looking up at the same patch of sky, thinking the exact same thing. The title of the book had been a hypothesis. The new particle found inside antimatter proves we are not alone in the multiverse. As Elena listened to the faint, violet hum of the stable Lazarus particle in her pocket, a gift from Ilara, she knew it was no longer a theory. It was the new reality. We were not alone. We were never alone. And finally, the symphony was beginning to play in tune.